Hey guys, it's Will. Welcome back to the channel. If you are not subscribed and you could subscribe, it would be hugely appreciated. Obviously, no pressure, but if you feel like it, it really does help the channel. Let's jump right into this video because I'm really excited today. This is the first video I'm recording of this nature. We will be talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark, the classic 1981 Steven Spielberg film, the beginning of the Indiana Jones franchise, starring Harrison Ford, of course. It was conceived of by Spielberg and George Lucas. The screenplay was written by Lawrence Kasdan. And what I'm going to be talking about in this video is the structure of the film, the act structure, the sequence structure, and a couple of the major plot points. One of the things I really want to do with this channel is explore screenwriting terminology, especially terminology that we all hear a lot, and kind of look at concrete examples of what it really means. So like the 3-act structure is something you hear about over and over and over again. When you read movie reviews, when you watch YouTube videos, people talk about this happens in the first act, this happens in the third act, this happens in the second act. What does that really mean? What are the acts of a screenplay? How are those broken down? What are the plot points that apply to different acts and things of that nature? But it is way easier to explain this when you have concrete examples rather than just talking about it abstractly. So I'm going to use Raiders of the Lost Ark in this video to talk about screenplay structure. I will be doing a similar video on The Matrix. I will be doing a similar video on Frozen, which is a movie you know I really love. I am prepping a similar video on the Super Mario Brothers movie, which came out in 2023. So I'm going to be doing a number of videos like this. But this is the first one where I'm really going to explore this idea. So there's two things I really want to say before I get into this video. And I want to say them quickly so we don't have a super long video because this is probably going to be kind of a long video. Number one is what my lineage is, basically. So I have an MFA, which is a Master of Fine Arts in Screenwriting. My primary professor who taught structure to me when I was in grad school was named Beth Serlin. Beth Serlin got her degree in screenwriting at USC, which is University of Southern California, which is, I think, widely considered one of the best, if not the best, film school in the world. Beth Serlin had a classmate whose name was Paul Joseph Gulino, who wrote this book, which is called Screenwriting, the Sequence Approach. You can buy this at any local bookstore or on bookshop.org or wherever it is that you buy books. But this is the book that we used as kind of our primary text for breaking down screenplay structure, sequences, acts, plot points, character arc, character triangles, like all that stuff when we were in grad school. So this is like the lineage that I come from. You can kind of almost think of it like martial arts, right? Like I'm from the Shaolin school or the Northern school or the Southern school, or I do this and I do that. And like in screenwriting, it's very much the same way. Like you're taught by someone who was taught by someone who was taught by someone, and you have this lineage of teacher and pupil relationships. And this is the lineage from which I come. There are people who were trained differently. There are people who learned by doing it, by just going out and writing, and everyone has a different approach. There are probably people who are very well educated or very well experienced who have completely different opinions from me, and that's totally fine. This is film theory, this is not film fact, and that's very important to point out. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that what I'm talking about is really kind of a mainstream American approach to breaking down stories. So if you start looking at avant-garde films, art house films, international films, some of them will fit this template, some of them will not. Again, this is screenwriting theory, not screenwriting fact. Everyone approaches things differently. You get filmmakers like Ringo Lam who are very much inspired by cause and effect. He's a Hong Kong filmmaker. He doesn't typically tend to have, exactingly mapped out act structures in his film. It's more a series of cause and effect and events pushing characters into further events and decisions and stuff like that. There's a really great screenwriter named John August. He wrote the film Go, which is an amazing movie with Sarah Polley, directed by Doug Liman, which came out in like 98 or 99. He wrote the Charlie's Angels reboot, which is a movie I absolutely love. He's worked a lot with Tim Burton, like he wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, he wrote Big Fish, and he does podcasts and he does a blog, and he's talked about how the structure of a screenplay, be it the sequences, the act structure, however you want to think of it, is essentially a skeleton. And if you think of the biodiversity of animals on Earth, every animal has a different skeleton, and that skeleton is tailored to the evolutionary needs of that animal. Screenplay structure is very much the same. So I'm talking about kind of generalized overview, high-level ideas about how you can put screenplays together, and I'm going to be using movies that kind of conform to this structural template, maybe not deliberately so, but they can be fit into the 3-act sequence-based structure. So let's jump into this video now that I did my little intro there, and like I said, we're going to be talking about the absolutely classic 1981 film that kicked off the Indiana Jones franchise, Raiders of the Lost Ark. So I made this in Photoshop. I'm not like a Photoshop whiz, so I know it's kind of rudimentary, and I apologize for that. But this is basic 3-act structure here. So you have Act 1, which we have at the beginning here, and right in the middle of Act 1, you see there's an inciting incident. So the inciting incident there you can see divides Act 1 into 2 sequences. What comes before the inciting incident and what comes after it. Then that bigger bar I have there is the divide between Act 1 and Act 2. Then in Act 2, you have 2 sequences divided by that small line. Then we reach the midpoint. Then we have 2 more sequences divided by that other small line there. Then you have a slightly bigger line. That's what breaks us into Act 3. In Act 3, we have the third act twist, and then we reach the conclusion of the film. So this is very basic and rudimentary. And like I said, I just kind of threw it together in Photoshop, but just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about before we jump into the movie. But now let's jump into the movie. So here we have, this is just the title card, just to get us excited because it's such a cool title card, Raiders of the Lost Ark. So the movie opens with what's called a teaser. A teaser basically introduces world, characters, tone, sometimes theme, and stuff like that. And it's a little scene at the beginning of a film that is not necessarily directly related to the events that follow, at least not in terms of a continuum. It really just kind of sets things up for you. You have this in a lot of mainstream blockbuster style films. You get it in fantasy and science fiction films. A lot of the times in like dramas or art house films or films of that nature, you don't have a teaser. But in these big blockbuster genre films, you very typically do have a teaser. And Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark has an incredible teaser. I'm actually going to be doing a separate video about why this teaser is so damn good. But basically, you have the teaser, and then you have Indy teaching in class, showing that he's a college professor. These 2 scenes together are the first sequence of the film, and what they do is establish what is called the status quo. So the status quo is essentially what is normal in this world. Indiana Jones goes on adventures, and then he comes back to the university and he teaches his class. That is the norm of the world, the norm of this character, and kind of the world that he inhabits day to day. So we call that the status quo. So that, like I said, is really this first little piece of line here before we hit the inciting incident. So now we're going to talk about the inciting incident. An inciting incident, the way that I define an inciting incident as a writer, is the thing that happens in the film, the event or the scene or whatever you want to call it, that makes the second act of the film inevitable. It's the thing that propels you inexorably towards the break from Act 1 into Act 2. The Act 2 goal in a typical mainstream American film is essentially what most people would think of as the plot of the film. So if you were describing like the plot of a movie to someone, you would probably be describing the Act 2 goal. The inciting incident is the thing that pushes you to that goal, and typically happens right in the middle of the first act. Now, what's so good about Raiders of the Lost Ark is that if you think of like a 2-hour movie, right, and it's divided into 8 sequences, as I've shown you here. There's 2 in Act 1, 2 in Act 3, and 4 in Act 2, so that's 8 sequences. Each one would be 15 minutes. The inciting incident in Raiders of the Lost Ark happens at almost exactly 15 minutes, like the scene that is the inciting incident. So what is that? It's when these government guys come to Indy and they tell him, Professor Abner Ravenwood, who was Indiana Jones's kind of like mentor when he was learning archaeology and all this stuff, was investigating the Staff of Ra, the Ark of the Covenant, and he went missing, and the Nazis are looking for these things too. So they're kind of consulting with Indy on like, what's your take on this, blah, blah, blah. And Indy's like, well, I can go and try to find Abner, and if I can't find him, I can try to find the Ark for you, or like whatever, right? So it sets up the idea of this adventure. Someone's missing. There's an object, which is the headpiece of the Staff of Ra, which is incredibly important to a lot of people, including the U.S. government and the Nazis, very, very bad guys. And Indiana Jones is in a position to be able to help them. So that's really our inciting incident, because that's what kicks off the adventure of the film and the second act of the movie. What happens in the next scene is that Indy's boss, who's the guy that you see right here in the middle of the frame, comes to him at his house and says, we got approval. from the university, from the government, whatever, you're a go, you can go on the mission. So the second sequence of Act 1 in this film is actually pretty short. It's basically just Indy talking to these guys in this scene, and then him getting approval to go off on this mission. I think it's about 6 or 7 minutes long. And about 21 or 22 minutes in, we have the break into the second act, which is to see where he gets on the plane. He is going on this adventure. He is off to find the professor and the headpiece of the Staff of Ra, but the ultimate goal of Act 2 is to find the Ark of the Covenant before the Nazis are able to find it. And all of these little goals, like see if we can find Professor Ravenwood, see if we can find the headpiece of the Staff of Ra, etc., these are sequences that play into the larger goal of the act. So essentially what a sequence is a sequence is a series of scenes oriented around a small goal that is playing into the larger goal of the act. So the act 2 sequence 1, right, is to either find Professor Ravenwood or to find the headpiece of the Staff of Ra. And that's he goes off on this mission in order to do that. So we are right at the beginning of Act 2 here. In that first sequence, we have inciting incident. You see the heavy black bar there, and we're on this next sequence, and he's gone off on his adventure, and he finds Marion, and Marion's got the headpiece of the Staff of Ra, and the Nazis show up there. Obviously, if you've seen this film, you know what's going on here. There's a big shootout, etc. Professor Ravenwood is not there, Abner. This takes place in Nepal, but he and Marion are able to escape the Nazis with the headpiece of the Staff of Ra. And there's basically only 2 scenes in the first sequence of Act 2 in this film. It's him on the airplane going off on his adventure, and then it's him meeting her in the bar, fighting with the Nazis, and them escaping. So that's the midpoint. We'll get to that in just a second here. The second sequence of Act 2 is for them to go to Cairo, to establish contact with Indy's guy in Cairo, and to start their mission to find the Ark of the Covenant. But when they get there, they run into Nazis and various other bad guys, and we get to the midpoint now. So Marion gets kidnapped, put into a truck. There's this kind of chase through the streets of Cairo, and Indy sees a truck blow up and go up in flames, and he believes, that's what this screenshot is here, that Marion is on that truck. So he believes that she is dead. So essentially the midpoint of the film, which is the end of sequence 4, which is Act 2, sequence 2, but in the screenplay as a whole, it's sequence 4, is this scene here where he thinks that she's dead. Now, obviously, spoilers, because we're going to go over the whole movie here. If you've seen the movie, you already know she's not dead, but he thinks that she's dead. This is a bit of a soft midpoint, and when I say soft midpoint, I don't mean to diminish the midpoint of this film, but that I feel as though, and I might be wrong about this, but I feel as though the idea of like a really hard midpoint as like a fulcrum in the center of the film is a more recent thing in screenwriting, and I think it was in part influenced by writers coming from writing episodic television and dividing a screenplay essentially into 2 episodes with this kind of hard midpoint in the middle around which the film kind of pivots. To give you an example of a movie that's written like this, look at Star Trek, which came out in, I think, 2008, the reboot with Chris Pine. And Zachary Quinto and Zoe Saldana is a great cast in that movie. I think Chris Hemsworth is in that movie too, right? Like in the very beginning, he plays Kirk's dad. Am I remembering that correctly? So that movie was written by Alex Kurtzman and Bob Orsi, who were this huge screenwriting duo who wrote like the Transformers films. I think they wrote The Island, the Michael Bay movie with Ewan McGregor and Scarlett Johansson. They wrote what's that awesome Mission Impossible 3, which is a fantastic screenplay. I actually know Bob Orsi. I knew Bob Orsi a little bit years ago. I haven't seen him in years, but I did talk to him about the Star Trek film, and he told me that they wrote that film as essentially 2 separate episodes built around this fulcrum of the midpoint, where the plot leads to the midpoint. There's this huge event, and then the second half of the film grows out of the midpoint. I think that's a more recent thing. And in a lot of older films, this movie being 42 years old at this point, even though it doesn't feel old to people like me who grew up watching this movie over and over again, this is kind of a soft midpoint. It's not this huge event that completely pivots the trajectory of the film. India is still operating towards the same goal, but it is the midpoint of the film in terms of where it comes structurally, right? So there we are right at the midpoint in the middle of Act 2. So then we're going to get into sequence 5, which is the third sequence of Act 2. And the goal of sequence 5 is to find the location of the Well of the Souls. So they go into this map room, right, if you're familiar with the film, and they use the headpiece of the Staff of Ra, the alignment of the sun, and all of that stuff to read the map to find the location of the Well of Souls. They're able to do that, and so then we move into the final sequence of Act 2, which is Act 2, Sequence 4, which is Act 6 altogether in the overall film, and the goal is to get the Ark. And they do that. They achieve the goal of the second act. Excuse me. And this is basically where we break into Act 3. So what happens next? The Nazis show up along with the French archaeologist, who's this guy crouching down here. They've found them, they've caught them, they've outnumbered them. They take the Ark and they leave Indy down in the hall with Marion wearing this ridiculous dress and a bunch of snakes. So now we break into Act 3. Indy is like abandoned in this area where the Ark was hidden, and the Nazis are leaving with the Ark. So the goal becomes, essentially the goal of Act 3 is to get the Ark back. So they need to escape this room in order to do that. So he and Marion are able to escape the room, and then Indy takes off after them. So this is the first sequence of Act 3. Indiana Jones is chasing the Nazis to get the Ark back to prevent them from using it. So we have this extremely famous scene where he is on horseback and he is galloping after them. It's inspired by the John Ford movie Stagecoach. He's galloping after these trucks and he's fighting with Nazis and he's jumping in and out of these cars. It's an amazing sequence. And he ends up getting the Ark back. So he achieves that goal. He gets on a boat with Marion with friendly sailors, and they're taking the Ark away. And this is where we get to, let me go back to our diagram here, the third act twist. This is a twist in the middle of the third act that pivots the structure of the third act. The Nazis show up on a submarine. They come onto the boat. They take Marion. They take the Ark. They don't find Indy, and they leave. So now he's got to rescue Marion. He's got to get the Ark back, or he's somehow just got to stop the Nazis from being able to use the power of the Ark to destroy the world or whatever their goal is. Right, so that's where we are right here. At the third act twist. We have one sequence left in this film. So Indy disguises himself in a Nazi uniform. He gets on the U-boat. He manages to follow them to this island where they're going to activate the Ark. He gets this rocket launcher, and he's like, I'm going to blow up the Ark. I'm going to kill you guys. Give me Marion. Give me the Ark back. And they call his bluff. Basically, they're like, you're not going to do that. You're not going to let us kill her. We know you love her. So he gets captured by the Nazis, and he fails his goal of retrieving the Ark. And they tie up him and they tie up Marion, and it looks like all hope is lost. But then what ends up happening, if you've seen the film, you know, Indy is essentially saved by his education, his quick thinking, his love of archaeology, and his knowledge of the artifacts for which he is looking, and in a way, his humility in the face of the power of God, because he closes his eyes. He tells Marion to close her eyes, because when they activate the Ark, they will be directly communicating with the power of God, and the humans do not have the ability to withstand that degree of power. So what happens? Yeah, buddy, Mr. Nazi gets his whole shit melted. And then Indy and Marion survive with their eyes closed as the flames of the power of God burn all around them. And that is essentially the end of the film. They get the Ark back, and as you know, if you've seen the film, the government takes the Ark and it stashes it away somewhere. But Indy lives, Marion lives, the Nazis all die, the Ark is taken out of the field of play and is no longer being used as a weapon. And it's a happy ending. Fin de cinema. So that is a basic breakdown of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Just looking at sequence structure and act structure. If there are other films, like I said, I'm going to do The Matrix, I'm going to do the Super Mario Brothers film, I'm going to do Frozen. If there are other films that you're interested in me talking about with regards to act structure and sequences and plot points and stuff like that, I would be happy to do so. Just drop a comment. One thing that I did not mention in this video at all is A story and B story. So A story is typically the physical plot of a movie, and the B story is the emotional plot of a movie, which in this film obviously is the love story. between Indy and Marion. And if you look at a film like The Matrix, the B story is also a love story. It is a love story between Neo and Trinity. And if there is a romantic story in a movie, like in Speed, you know, the A story of Speed is to deal with the bus and not let the bomb blow up. The B story is Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock falling in love with one another. So that's typically the setup of an A story, B story. It's not always like in Lethal Weapon. It's a little bit different because it's not a romantic love story. It's more of a story of dealing with trauma and learning to trust people again and that kind of thing. But there are A story, B story, and you get into stuff like character triangles, character arc, and things of that nature. I'm going to do a video pretty soon on character arc, talking about Frozen and the arcs of the characters in that film. But like I said, drop in the comments any movie for which you are interested in me doing like a structural breakdown like this. It might be interesting to do like completely atypical movies that are not Hollywood movies, that are not mainstream movies, that do not conform to this at all. And I could kind of look at them and try to find an act structure, within them. My name is Will. I thank you as always for watching the channel. Hope you liked this video. We'll see you next time.